Welcome to 31 class. This week for week 4, we're diving into some revolutionary words and voices. This lecture title is Liberty, Reason, and Resistance in the American Enlightenment. This week we're diving into a pivotal moment in American literary and political history. It's the era of the American Revolution and the rise of the Enlightenment thought. You'll be reading works that help define the ideals of the new nation, but also works that challenge and complicate those ideals from within. Our focus this week is Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, and selected poems by Phillis Wheatley. These texts allow us to explore how concepts like freedom, equality, reason, and faith were used and questioned during the founding of the United States. First, we'll jump into Thomas Paine from Common Sense, 1776. Thomas Paine was a British-born writer who immigrated to America in 1774. Paine wrote Common Sense to convince ordinary colonists that independence from Britain was not only reasonable, but it was necessary. Paine writes in clear, persuasive prose for the common reader. He rejects monarchy, calling it unnatural and tyrannical. He uses analogies, moral arguments, and just plain logic to drive home his points. Key strategies and examples from the text are when he uses analogy. Paine compares hereditary monarchy to a man choosing rulers from among his children at random. He writes, one of the strongest natural proofs of the folly of hereditary right in kings is that nature disapproves it. He gives a moral argument. He portrays British rule as abusive and morally corrupt, urging colonists to break away from oppression. He states, even brutes do not devour their young, nor savages make war upon their families. Then he just uses outright plain logic. He appeals to the reader's reason. There is something absurd in supposing that a continent to be perpetually governed by a small island. The key line from this text comes, it's really sweet and short, "'Tis time to part." Paine doesn't just argue for independence, he creates a moral and emotional urgency around independence. His pamphlet helped galvanize support for the revolution by turning political philosophy into a public rallying cry. This guy you might have heard of before, Thomas Jefferson. He wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Thomas Jefferson was a Virginia statesman and intellectual who drafted the Declaration to justify the colony's break from Great Britain. The document draws heavily from philosopher John Locke, an Enlightenment philosopher who argued that individuals have natural rights. They are life, liberty, and property. Locke also argued that governments exist by consent of the governed, and when they fail, the people have a right to revolt. Jefferson reworked Locke's life, liberty, and property line into a more poetic and idealistic life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You've probably heard of that. The key Enlightenment ideals that were in the Declaration were reason over tradition, and human rights are universal and inalienable. Lastly, that government must protect liberty, not restrict it. The structure of the piece is Jefferson states a universal principle of human and equality and rights. Then he lists the grievances against King George III. Lastly, he declares the colonies free and independent states. Famous lines from the piece are, of course, all men are created equal, and then governments deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, meaning that the people are who should drive the government. A discussion point for this text are, how do Jefferson and Paine use Enlightenment values to justify their rebellion? And how do we reconcile Jefferson's ideals with the reality of slavery? Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about Phillis Wheatley's selected poems. Phillis Wheatley was kidnapped from West Africa and enslaved in Boston, where she was taught to read and write, something that was illegal in the South, by the way. She became the first African American and one of the first women to publish a book of poetry in America. Her work combines Christian faith, classical learning, and sharp intellect. Let's look at 4 of her key poems. First, on being brought from Africa to America. It's a short, subtle, and deeply ironic poem. Wheatley outwardly expresses gratitude for being brought to Christianity, but turns the poem into a moral rebuke against racism. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. This is a couple lines from the poem. Then she calls out white Christian hypocrisy and closes with a reminder. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. The key idea here is that Wheatley uses Christianity itself to challenge the idea of black inferiority. Her tone is restrained, but her message is radical. Salvation and dignity are universal and for all people. Next, the poem to the University of Cambridge in New England. She addressed this to Harvard students. This early poem challenges them to pursue virtue and to avoid sin. Some lines from the text. Improve your privileges while they stay, ye pupils, and each hour redeem that bears or good or bad report of you to heaven. Why it's bold. Wheatley, a young enslaved black woman, is preaching to elite white men. She positions herself as a spiritual equal, if not a superior, using them to uphold the moral responsibility their education demands of them. On the death of the Reverend Mr. George Whitefield. Whitefield was a major preacher in the Great Awakening. Whitley praises his evangelical, wow, I can't say that word, zeal, evangelical seal, and his message of equality before God. Sorry, y'all. He prayed that grace in every heart might dwell. He longed to see America excel. She then connects Whitefield's mission to her own hope for spiritual justice, even for enslaved Africans. Take him, ye Africans, he longs for you. Impartial Savior is his title due. The key idea in this poem is that Wheatley aligns her voice with Whitefield's and suggests that true Christianity must include all races. Her tone is reverent, but her theology is radical. Next, Thoughts on the Works of Providence. This is a larger meditative poem that reflects on the majesty and order of God's creation. A couple of lines here. Arise, my soul, on wings enraptured, rise to praise the monarch of the earth and skies. She then blends enlightenment and admiration for natural order with Christian wonder with these lines. The stars that in their courses roll have each assigned a different pole. The key idea here is that Wheatley unites faith and reason, echoing enlightenment admiration for a rational universe, but insists that human humility must remain before divine wisdom. So I want to bring it all together now and talk about the contradictions of the revolution. This week's text all share powerful ideals, freedom, equality, and self-determination, but they also reveal some tensions. For instance, Paine, his voice was of the common citizen. He emphasized liberty through reasons, but the contradictions there are that he ignores race and gender. For Jefferson, he's a voice of the political elite. He emphasizes the natural rights and rebellion. The contradiction with him is that he owns slaves. So there's this ideal that he holds versus the reality of the situation. Then there's Wheatley, who's the enslaved poet. She emphasizes Christian and moral equality. The contradiction here is that it exposes hypocrisy through the grace she presents. Wheatley is particularly important because she inhabits the same enlightenment and religious discourses, yet uses them to subvert the exclusions within them. Her work urges us to ask, whose freedom was the revolution really fighting for? For our final thought, the American Revolution was a literary revolution too. These writers weren't just shaping a nation. They were shaping a language of rights, resistance, and identity that continues to evolve today. Thank you for your time.